Welcome back to the last of my Metroid Dread videos. Today I'm going to review different aspects of the game and give you my thoughts about the latest entry in the Metroid series. I thought Metroid Dread's story was sufficient, and I mean that in a positive way. Obviously the Metroid franchise isn't known for its narrative or for diving deep into the lore, but I felt like what we got was just right, both in quantity and in scope. We're playing as a mostly silent bounty hunter with the goal of returning to her ship, so I didn't expect more than the surface level connections to other characters we got here. I thought both Quiet Robe and Ravenbeak were fine. Quiet Robe was strictly a vehicle for exposition, and while I'm not really a fan of exposition dumps, I understand the difficulty of telling a story in this setting otherwise. Maybe I'm a little more lenient since the Metroid series is one of my favorites, but a sudden appearance, narrative vomit, and immediate death didn't ruin the game for me. It's the same with Ravenbeak. Aside from a few seconds of screen time at the beginning, his role was basically to turn on the story fire hose for a minute and then provide us with a final boss battle. But again, overall this didn't ruin the game for me. While the information we received from Quiet Robe and Ravenbeak felt a bit clunky, with the different Chozo tribes and multiple instances of DNA splicing, I felt like the characters themselves were only as relevant as they needed to be, and given the series lore, they neither under nor overstayed their welcome. Maybe the only disappointing character was Adam. This time around, he didn't come across as coldly as he did in Metroid Fusion, but there was also no indication of any growth in the relationship between him and Samus, despite the revelation about his true character in that game. If anything, he lost a bit of the personality he had in Fusion. Strictly informative is how I would describe Adam here. His sole purpose was to direct the player, and though I poked a little fun at his robotic voice in the beginning, it ended up being disappointingly appropriate. If there is one thing I would have changed about the story, it would have been not to end Ravenbeak's plan for cloning Metroid Samus so soon, because that could have made for an interesting follow-up game. I've been intrigued by the evil twin slash doppelganger slash rival trope since my first run-in with Shadow Link at the end of Zelda 2, and coupled with my disappointment that we only got to fight one of the 10 SAX that Adam mentioned in Metroid Fusion, I think it would have been cool to get a game where we have to hunt down clones of Metroid Samus, maybe even tie them to the recovery of Samus's abilities. I know that seems derivative of both Metroid 2 and Metroid Prime 2, but I can't help but think that there was an idea there that got written off a little too quickly. One final note, why was Kraid in this game? I understand fan service and playing off of nostalgia, but I don't think he really fit here. Fighting Ridley in Metroid Fusion made a little more sense with how the X function, but that wasn't the case here. If we fought Kraid after the X were released, or if he was actually an X and that was the first time we were exposed to the X in-game, it would have fit a little better. But as it stands, Kraid's inclusion just didn't seem very natural. Anyway, despite my nitpicking, overall I thought Metroid Dread felt like a genuine continuation of where we left off 19 years ago, and it left me excited to see where the next entry in the story takes us. Now on to the most important aspect of any Metroid game, the gameplay. There is a greater sense of freedom and exploration in Metroid Dread than in Metroid Fusion, regardless of the degree of its artificiality. It didn't feel as free as Super Metroid, but it also didn't feel like it was as on rails as Fusion did. Granted, there were a few times where the veil covering the rails was pretty thin, but I've played some hallways decorated with story like Final Fantasy XIII, and Dread felt nowhere near that linear. The pacing as a whole felt faster than previous Metroid games. Whether it was due to the movements, the animations, the level design, the story, or all of the above, for me, Dread landed somewhere between being a fast-paced game and a game designed almost strictly for speedrunners. Some games are enthralling enough that you want to keep playing to see what happens next, but Dread made that seem like the only option, and an option like that just isn't as enjoyable if you don't get the sense that you're the one who chose it. Combat was a mixed bag for me. This is a series where you spend a lot of time shooting at enemies, and slowing that down with the counter mechanic felt like a chore sometimes. Enemies took so many hits most of the time that it felt like the only way to play without developing carpal tunnel was to surrender to the counter mechanic, which doesn't really jive too well in a series that provides a lot of freedom otherwise. Along those lines, I wasn't a fan of the QTEs during the boss fights either. The cinematic interludes and endings were fine, but I could have done without so many QTEs. The bottom line is, sometimes you just want to use your powers to blast away at your enemies, and Dread really clamped down on that. The bosses in Metroid Dread were great overall. This is a series known for cool boss fights, and Dread didn't disappoint. Now some of them, like SQ and Golzuna, weren't particularly exciting, but their shortcomings were more than made up for by Drogaiga, experiment numbers Z57, and Ravenbeak. I loved all the stuff happening during the Drogaiga fight, and having to juggle attacking, dodging, multiple steps between the water, and then actually dealing damage to it was a nice change of pace from just unloading super missiles into a boss as quickly as possible. Z57 was my favorite boss in the game. It wasn't easy to the point of being boring, but nor was it overly punishing. I thought the phase with the fans was both creative and rewarding, and I'd love to see more ideas like this in future Metroid games. Finally, Ravenbeak was a great final boss. He was definitely more on the punishing side of things, but at no point during the hour plus that I spent trying to beat him did I blame anything but my own skill. Nothing ever felt frustrating or unfair. I could attribute every instance of damage or death to my failure to slide, control my jumps properly, or use flash shift at the right time. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't address the Emmys. Not intimidating name aside, I absolutely loved the Emmy sections of the game. With a name like Metroid Dread, I expected to encounter lots of tension, and thankfully it was plentiful in Dread. In Metroid Fusion, the most disappointing thing for me was that all of the SAX encounters were scripted. I thought it would have been exciting to suddenly come across the SAX while exploring, and then have to come up with an escape plan on the fly. While Dread limited the Emmys to only certain areas, going into those areas blind provided the exact sense of tension that I wanted with the SAX. My only critique about the Emmys is that more variety with the encounters would have been appreciated. Activating the water valve in the second Emmy zone was a nice wrinkle that broke up the running, jumping, and sliding that became typical of these areas later, and I wish there were more like it. The gameplay overall felt like classic Metroid. I appreciate the attempts to throw a few new things into the series, despite not all of them sticking the landing. Hopefully the next installment gives us just a bit more freedom to explore, or at the very least the illusion of it. Finally, I want to talk about power-ups. Unfortunately, despite power-ups being a hallmark of Metroid games, I was pretty disappointed with the power-ups in Metroid Dread. To be clear, I understand it's challenging to come up with new and exciting abilities, especially when they'll inevitably be compared to the previous Metroid games. And I don't mind some power-ups being recycled from older games, especially iconic ones like the Screw Attack or the Speed Booster. But there were three aspects in Dread that I feel were the reason Dread's power-ups lacked the panache they had in previous games. First, I didn't like the obsolescence or superfluousness of some of the power-ups, particularly the Spin Boost and Cross Bomb. I actually thought the Space Jump wouldn't be in the game with the presence of the Spin Boost, but when I got the Space Jump, it made the time spent getting the Spin Boost seem like a waste. As for the Cross Bomb, I expected it to replace the Power Bomb. As it stands, however, it provided nearly zero benefit in both exploration and combat. Perhaps the Cross Bomb has more use in a 100% run, but in my casual playthrough, aside from the short section after obtaining the power-up, I couldn't figure out why it was even in the game. Next, the Spider Magnet. Aside from the parts where I had to hang on to a magnet panel, the Spider Magnet was way too slow. As I mentioned before, Metroid Dread as a whole felt like a faster paced game than previous entries, and the Spider Magnet slowed that down immensely. Too often I found myself trying to wall jump or use the grapple beam to get past a magnet wall, and by the time I found the space jump, I did everything possible to avoid climbing with the Spider Magnet. I think I would have enjoyed it more if Samus simply moved faster while using it, but as it stands, there were very few instances where I was glad I had to use the Spider Magnet. Third, the Aeon abilities felt underused. Again, given the pace of everything in the game, the inclusion of slow abilities felt out of place. The flash shift was the most satisfying of the three, and I used it often, especially in boss battles, but as a movement ability in a fast-paced game, it was simply keeping up with expectations rather than exceeding them. The Phantom Cloak and the Pulse Radar, on the other hand, felt forgotten shortly after they were obtained. Perhaps this is more of a knock against the overall design of the game than it is the Aeon abilities, but regardless, I wouldn't have been saddened by their exclusion given the rest of the game. And one quick note, I wish the Morph Ball was faster. It's a very minor issue, and while I wasn't looking for the absurdly fast movement speed of previous Metroid games, it just felt a little too slow. And those are my thoughts on Metroid Dread. It's certainly not a perfect game by any means, but I enjoyed every minute of the experience. Despite its shortcomings, I thought it was a solid entry in the Metroid series, and I'm looking forward to playing through it many more times in the future. Sound off in the comments below and let me know what you think about my take on Metroid Dread, and I'll see you next mission.